Welcome, everyone. Talk about a turnout. This is outstanding, especially on election night and with so many other things going on. I'm Melinda Schlitt. I'm chair of the Art and Art History Department, and on behalf of the department, I want to thank you all for attending tonight's Weiner Lecture. I think you'll be in for a real treat. Before I introduce our speaker, I want to acknowledge the generosity of Robert and Jane Weiner, who established this endowed lecture series in 1984. It is through this annual event that we're able to invite exciting and dynamic critics and artists who have been widely recognized for their work in their respective fields. While Jane is sadly no longer with us, we are most grateful to Robert and the Weiner family for their continued support and interest in our program and in Dickinson College. It is not often that we have someone of Michael Fried's stature as a speaker in the Department of Art and Art History, and we are honored that he is here tonight to present our annual Weiner Lecture. Michael is professor at the Johns Hopkins University, where he has taught since 1975 and holds two appointments, the J.R. Herbert Boone Chair in the Humanities and professor in the Department of the History of Art. His awards and accolades are many, far too many to mention here, but I will nonetheless highlight a few. He has been a visiting professor at Wesleyan, Northwestern, Cornell, Harvard, the University of Zurich, and the École Normale Supérieure in Paris, and the American Academy in Rome. He has held fellowships from the American Council of Learned Societies, the Guggenheim Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, among others, and has received numerous awards, including the Academy Award in Literature from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, and the Andrew Mellon Foundation Distinguished Achievement Award. Michael is truly unique among most of us in academia today in that he is a bona fide polymath, accomplished and esteemed as an art critic, art historian, literary critic, and poet. The range and depth of subjects he takes on and the probing intellectual inquiry that he brings to bear on his interpretive and critical readings is provocative, challenging, and always new. One often learns to see differently after encountering a critical narrative by Michael Fried. While I was a graduate student in the history of art at Johns Hopkins many years ago, I never had the good fortune to take a seminar with Michael, but I have nonetheless been a continual student in absentia through keeping up with his prodigious outpouring of books and essays. Some of the transformative books he has written include Absorption and Theatricality, Painting and Beholder in the Age of Diderot, that was in 1980, Realism Writing Disfiguration on Thomas Eakins and Stephen Crane in 1987, Courbet's Realism in 1990, Manet's Modernism or the Face of Painting in the 1860s, 1996, Why Photography Matters as Art as Never Before, 2000, and his recent tour de force, The Moment of Caravaggio in 2010, which was based on the Mellon lectures he delivered at the National Gallery of Art and which was the winner of the 2010 American Publishers Award for Professional and Scholarly Excellence in Art History and Criticism. His most recent book, in 2011, concerns 4 contemporary artists and has been received with critical acclaim, entitled 4 Honest Outlaws, Sala, Ray, Marioni, and Gordon. His essays have appeared over the years in the most prominent art historical, critical, and literary journals. And in case you were wondering about his work as a poet, he has been published in the most prominent journals in that genre as well, including the Paris Review, the Southern Review, Raritan, American Poetry Review, Critical Inquiry, among others. The last line of Michael's faculty webpage on the Johns Hopkins site reads, "He is convinced that there is nothing harder to do than write a successful poem." I'm sure that the ancient Greek poet Sappho, represented in David's painting tonight, would readily agree. Please join me in welcoming Michael Fried.
So I'll simply second Melinda and say that when Melinda and I realized that tonight was election night, we imagined that the audience might be in single figures. So we are, I have to say, I'm like unbelievably impressed that so many of you have come out. It's now 30 years since the publication of a book that Melinda Schlitt just mentioned, Absorption and Theatricality. And I'm going to proceed this evening on a kind of assumption which may well not be true, but it's just going to enable me to move a little bit more quickly, that at least some portion of the audience is familiar with the basic claim in that book and subsequent ones on Courbet and Manet. And now here's the claim, so that if you're not familiar with it, now you get it. That in the course of the 1750s and 1760s in France, there emerged what I have called a new anti-theatrical conception of the art of painting. The crucial figure in the articulation of that conception was the great philosophe and the first great, and in some ways the greatest art critic to this date, Denis Diderot, both in his salons, his art criticism, and other writings on painting, and in his early texts on the theory of the stage, the Conversations on the Natural Sun and the Discourse on Dramatic Poetry. But the conception can also be discerned in the writing of other critics as well, and this is what really matters. It plays out importantly in the work of a number of significant painters, from Chardin to Joseph Vernet, Vien, Greuze, Fragonard, and our key figure this evening, Jacques-Louis David. The basic idea is that the painter was called upon to depict figures who would appear to the beholder to be truly, totally engaged, or, a key term for me, absorbed in what they are ostensibly doing, feeling, and thinking. Only if that were the case, only if the figures really seemed to be absorbed, would the beholder find himself or herself stopped and transfixed before the picture, a condition that itself emerged at this time as the sine qua non of a successful painting. By the same token, the least hint in the treatment of the figures that one or more of them were less than wholly absorbed, that instead of seeming totally caught up in what they were doing, they appeared instead to be acting or behaving with the beholder in view, I mean to make a particular impression on their audience, and both the figures and the painting as a whole would be judged théâtral, theatrical, the very worst of faults according to the new aesthetic. More broadly, what the rise of that aesthetic indicates is that starting shortly after the middle of the 18th century in France, and for the time being only there, the very existence of the beholder, more precisely what I've called the primordial convention that paintings are made to be beheld, emerged for the first time as a fundamental problem for the art of painting, that is, for its continuation at the very highest level. Only if the presence of the beholder before the canvas could somehow be neutralized or negated by one means or another, principally by the depiction of figures who appeared oblivious to anything but the object of their absorption, or say to the accomplishment of a particular intention, was distinguished achievement possible. And the alternative to such achievement, work that seemed theatrical, was extremely dire. We might say that a new sort of gulf between successful and unsuccessful art opened up at this time. In the last pages of Absorption and Theatricality, I subject Jacques-Louis David's first truly major painting, the one now on the screen, Belisarius Receiving Alms of 1781, to an extended analysis. Belisarius was a Byzantine general, and he had been a glorious warrior, and at this point, because of machinations in the government, he is reduced to blindness and reduced to begging. And what we see is a soldier who had served under him recognizing him. This was in a very influential literary text of the period by a man named Marmontel. So I subject David's first truly major painting, the Belisarius Receiving Alms of 1781, to an extended analysis, in the course of which I try to show that various features of that work, Belisarius' blindness, if he's blind, he isn't aware of being beheld, the actions of the soldier placing a coin, the actions of the woman placing a coin in his helmet, and above all, the curious organization of the picture's architecture and overall composition, combine to suggest a deliberate effort on the part of the painter to bring about a kind of mutual displacement of the beholder in front of the painting away from the figure of Belisarius. By my reference to the picture's organization, I refer first to its almost exaggeratedly off-center perspective structure. Let me see if I can, and you can see that here. It's as if you've got this very strong perspective structure that ostensibly places the viewer here away from Belisarius, which I read as seeking to position the beholder over towards the painting's left-hand edge, almost directly in front of the figure of the soldier and as far as possible from that of Belisarius. And second, even more radical, to establishing in the Belisarius, the establishing of a second plane of representation, defined by the direction in which the blind hero faces, by the arch of triumph against the base of which he sits, and most strikingly, and I'm talking about this now, by the plane of the masonry block that sits there, and on that masonry block's plane is inscribed this Latin motto, Date obolum Belisario, give alms to Belisarius. What's so striking is that that's where it's inscribed, not on that face, which again seems to posit a very strong bias that way, away from the viewer. That is, David seems to have explored the possibility of rotating the frontal plane of the representation 90 degrees clockwise along the axis of its right-hand edge, as if you could imagine that he would take the front plane of the painting and swing it into the painting until it was where the plane of the arch is and where the plane of that block is, in order to isolate within his painting a second, more essential tableau consisting of Belisarius and his young guide, placed at right angles to the first, and therefore, this is the point, not directly exposed to the actual beholder's gaze. Both strategies, the implied positioning of the beholder away from Belisarius by the perspective and the implied rotation of the second tableau away from the beholder, imagine the beholder to be a kind of source of cognitive, ontological, a source of disturbance, one that must be neutralized, almost literally put out of view if the painting is to succeed. In other words, my claim is that this is going on in the painting, that this was part of the structure of David's intentions when he made the painting. His next ambitious history painting, the really epic-making Oath of the Horatii of 1784, exhibited in the Salon of 1785, it's the painting that, at a single stroke, established David's reputation as the most important painter in Europe, has been the focus of considerable discussion for a long time now. Much of that discussion has concerned the question of pictorial unity. Specifically, it's been suggested that David sought, in the Horatii, to challenge prevailing conceptions of unity, if not indeed to call into question the value of pictorial unity as such. So, for example, Norman Bryson has described what he takes to be David's assault on unity, and Thomas Crow has argued that the very qualities of the Horatii that previous art historians had viewed as epitomizing its, quote, perfect fusion of form and content, unquote, that's a phrase by a historian named Hugh Honor, and now this is Crow again, exist to sustain and validate the more immediate message of discord and provocation, unquote. In fact, the response of contemporary critics confirms that the Horatii was seen as challenging established ideas about how paintings ought to hold together. But I want to insist on the extent to which perhaps its most radical compositional feature, the stark division between the principal group of the elder Horatius and his sons swearing their oath and the secondary group of the swooning, grieving women. I mean the fact that we have this very strong male group here and then the women here with all behind her. I mean, this is a scene in the early history of Rome. Rome is about to settle a dispute with another city by having the 3 Horatii sons serve as champions for Rome and go out and fight 3 brothers from the other city. The trouble is that one of the brothers from the other city is engaged to one of the sisters of the Horatii. When the fight takes place, 5 of the 6 brothers die. The only one who survives and Rome wins is here, the oldest Horatii brother. And then there's a story that goes on from there. But this is the depicting of the father making them swear an oath to fight or die for Rome. And I want to suggest that so there's been a lot of talk about whether or not this group seen against that group with this division, whether or not that's to be understood as an attack on the very notion of pictorial unity. I think it's a radical thing to have done, but I don't think it's an attack on the notion of pictorial unity because it amounts to a kind of recycling, a revision of something that took place. I wish this image was stronger. This is a painting by the great French 17th century painter Poussin from the middle of the 17th century. And it depicts a scene, again, ancient history, a man named Eudamus, a citizen of Corinth, who had been a good citizen. He fought in its battles. There's a shield and sword on the wall that shows that. But he's also essentially penniless, and he is dying. That's a doctor taking his pulse. And this is, in effect, a notary taking down his last will and testament. The painting is called Testament of Eudamus. And it's a famous story in Stoic philosophy, because in effect what he does is leave the care of his mother and daughter to friends of his in the city. I mean, in other words, his bequest is to leave them in the care of these friends in the perfect confidence that these friends will look after them. And this is seen in its own way as morally exemplary. And here you have this, again, the back of this figure and the women there. The two women, the woman and the notary, in effect, turn their backs to one another. And we get this compositional division, which in the case of the Poussin couldn't conceivably be meant as anything but a kind of brilliant form of unity. Now, the fascinating thing here is that the Testament of Eudamus was seen by Diderot, this key critic, as it's actually for him the exemplary painting from the past. Right? It's the paradigm of what painting can be. He talks about it again and again. And it would have been known in particular through engravings that were made after it and had circulated. So we're talking about a very famous image. And Diderot sees that painting, and he sees the groupings as very powerfully expressive of the obliviousness of the members of the two groups to everything but their own thoughts and feelings. He remarks more than once on how deeply moving he finds the figure of the grieving woman who sits with her back turned toward the dying man. In other words, what strikes him is just how deeply absorbed those figures seem to be in what they're doing. And the consistency of the emotional tonality across that division doubtless contributed to the overall unity of effect that made the Eudamus for him the very paradigm of a pictorial tableau. Now, I think David in the Horatii sought to achieve a comparable effect of absorption and unity, but that his shift, especially in the principal group, especially in the men, to a far more vibrantly dramatic expressive register, from absorption in taking a dying man's pulse and transcribing his last will and testament, to absorption, or say total engagement, in swearing a mortal oath to fight and, if necessary, die for Rome, makes the division in the David even more salient and contrasting than in the Eudamus. A larger historical point is that whereas the presence of the beholder simply wasn't an issue for Poussin, as I earlier remarked, the beholder emerged as a problem for painting only in the course of the 1750s and 60s, not in the 17th century. I take David's commitment in the Horatii to an intensified mode of pictorial drama and to a heightened, because more schematic mode of compositional unity, to have been essentially anti-theatrical in intent. In other words, anti-theatricality isn't an issue for Poussin, though absorption is. I mean, his art just is deeply absorbed much of the time. By the time we get to David, absorption becomes a vehicle for trying to achieve a kind of neutralization of the presence of the beholder before the painting. Now, experience has taught me, I'm throwing a lot of stuff at you, but it's the only way of getting at what's coming up. Experience has taught me that my emphasis on anti-theatricality as a structure of artistic intention, or on the part of the critic, of demand and expectation, rather than as a quality or effect in hearing or failing to inhere, timelessly, so to speak, in certain pictures, is difficult to grasp. What I mean by that is, if you were to say to me, is the Poussin anti-theatrical or is it theatrical, I'd want to say, it just wasn't, those weren't issues for Poussin. They were issues for David. So, and what we're doing here is trying to understand these works historically. So it's not a quality that inheres in one picture or another in some timeless way. And I think I can make that a little clearer if we look at a slightly later moment in David's career. The moment is the second half of the 1790s. So Horatii is 1784-85. We're moving now to the second half of the 1790s, at which time David was working on the intervention of the Sabine women in the Louvre, completed in 1799. So this is a moment in early Roman history, again, where there's a moment even earlier than this when the Romans in Rome realized that they didn't have enough women. I mean, they just weren't going to be able to propagate. So they went to a nearby city and they kidnapped the women. There are paintings that depict that called the Rape of the Sabines. Rape here meaning simply the kind of kidnapping, the abduction of all these women, whom they then took back to Rome, married, and over the next few years, the women produced all the little kids that you see here. But then finally the men in the other city kind of worked up their courage and attacked Rome to bring the women home. And we have a kind of mass slaughter between the men in the two cities until Hersilia, who is the wife of Romulus, the Roman leader, intervenes and in effect says, look, the time for a good fight was 2 years ago. Now all you're going to do is make us widows and make our children orphans, so, you know, shake hands and forget about it. It's, things have worked out. We don't need a bloody war. And this is an important little moment in early Roman history. It's also a painting that's made in the wake of the French Revolution after the end of the Terror. So politically, it carries the implication of a kind of reconciliation on a political level between the different parties. So we know from the testimony of a man named Etienne Jean Delecluse, who was at that time a student in David's atelier. David was the most important teacher of painting in Europe through these years. And Delecluse later became a leading art critic and indeed wrote a biography of David. We know from him that while David was working on the Sabines, David himself characterized the composition of the Horatii that you've just been looking at as theatrical in a pejorative sense. So we know that David thought in these categories. And he said, you know, I still think it's a pretty terrific painting, the Horatii, but the composition is un peu théâtral. What David seems to have meant by this was that the unprecedented dramatic intensity that made the Horatii so electrifying at the Salon of 1785 had come to strike him more than 10 years later as at least somewhat excessive and exaggerated, which is to say, as too deliberately aiming to impress. If you've gone too far in some direction, that's going to be theatrical through a kind of overemphasis. And in fact, the Sabines, compared to the Horatii, marks a clear and deliberate withdrawal from the values and effects of pictorial drama as these had been brought to a new pitch of expressiveness in David's history paintings of the 1780s, like the Horatii. In particular, David plainly found it necessary to eschew the compositional strategy basic to the earlier pictures, the evocation of a single, highly specific moment of tension or crisis, a strategy that reaches its zenith and perhaps its breaking point in another picture called the Brutus, in favor of a less actively temporal. You see, if you go back to the Horatii, you get this sense of kind of burning instant as they're swearing the oath, right? With all of that drapery almost flapping in the wind, snapping in the wind, the muscles flexed, and so on. And then we move to this, and look at the pose, for example, of Romulus holding his spear. What we have here is what I want to describe as a less actively temporal mode of representation. It might be said to depict a moment of a sort, but one that has been dilated, expanded, almost to the point of no longer serving to advance the action, and within which the actors themselves have been made to relax, to suspend their efforts in a general détente. The de-dramatization of action is most apparent in the sleek-limbed figure of Romulus, poised to throw his spear, but it's also at work in the crowding of the pictorial field with innumerable persons at different distances from the viewer, as well as in the atmospheric perspective that gives the painting as a whole its almost silvery tone. And it's all but made explicit in a small livret, a small booklet, a little brochure that was issued to accompany the public exhibition of the Sabines in 1799. When David finished it, he didn't send it to the Salon. He made a private exhibition of it. People had to pay money to get in. This was a very controversial thing to do. And he provided this little booklet. And in the booklet, he gives a speech of more than 170 words for Hercilia, basically saying the time to have had this fight was 2 years ago. Knock it off now. Romulus's wife, whom the painting depicts intervening between her husband and the chief of the Sabines to prevent further bloodshed. And I want to suggest that the effect of the painting and the text together, you sort of look at the painting and you read 170 words. It's as if the painting, instead of marking a single instant in an action, marks the length of time that it would take for those 170 words to be said, or I want to suggest almost like sung. It's almost like an aria in an opera. Now, it may seem as if, for this reason, the Sabines just is finally more theatrical than the Horatii. And indeed, within roughly 10 years of its exhibition in 1799, the Sabines was strongly criticized by various important critics, eventually even by a great French writer who was also an art critic, Stendhal, for its reliance on figures holding static gestures taken from the stage. But David's criticism of the Horatii, reported by Delacluse, suggests that the stylistic and compositional innovations of the Sabines were largely anti-theatrical in intent, as difficult as that may be to reconcile with the painting's seeming emphasis on self-display. Put slightly differently, it's as though for David in the second half of the 1790s, the depiction of what would shortly come to be viewed as figures not so much acting as posing offered the only seemingly viable alternative to the inherent excessiveness of the dramatic. I mean, one way of thinking about this is you see how difficult it is to achieve something like an effect of anti-theatricality that sticks. If you go towards intensity, that will come to seem merely exaggerated, therefore appealing to an audience. If you draw back from the intensity, that will come to seem as if the figures are merely posing, and that's for an audience. Right? So it's an ongoing problem about how to try to do this if this emerges as central, and my claim is that it was central. David's withdrawal from dramatic values and effects, the kind of move we see from the Horatii to the Sabines, and in a sense from action and expression as such, is carried still further in his next and last ambitious history painting, the Leonidas at Thermopylae, which he began in 1800 and finished only in 1814, in which the principal, these are the 300 Spartans who are going to be holding off 500,000 Persians at Thermopylae, and indeed all of them eventually die. Right? It's a particular heroic moment in classical history. And in this painting, the principal action, that of Leonidas, the Spartan leader, Spartan king, Spartan general in the center of the painting, is explicitly atemporal and anti-dramatic, a purely inward act of meditation, consecration, prayer. And again, Delacroix gives us invaluable information. He quotes David from the studio at that time. "I want to paint a general and his soldiers preparing for combat like true Spartans, knowing that they will not survive, some absolutely calm, others braiding flowers to attend the banquet that they will hold in Hades. I want to try to put aside those movements, those theatrical expressions, which the moderns call painting of expression. But it will be hard to establish such ideas in our time. Everyone loves coup de théâtre, that's the term of Diderot's again, and when one doesn't paint the violent passions, when one doesn't push expression in painting to the point of grimace, that's another theatrical term, one risks being neither understood nor admired." So we have again here like absolutely knocked down evidence for his anti-theatrical ambitions. David's repudiation, in terms derived from Diderot, of the taste for pictorial drama that his own painting of the 1780s, like the Horatii, had done much to promote, could hardly be more emphatic. Okay, now all this suggests that in the course of 30 years, 1784 to 1814, the project of seeking to defeat the theatrical had changed its meaning profoundly. The Horatii, the Socrates, and the Brutus, I've claimed, were quickly and widely accepted as exemplary masterpieces. The Socrates and the Brutus are two other paintings of the 1780s. Were accepted as exemplary masterpieces largely on the strength of being seen as representing with unequaled perspicuousness figures wholly absorbed in a moment of tension or crisis in the unfolding of a heroic, tragic action. Within less than a decade, however, David moved in the Sabines to a far less urgently dramatic mise en scène, one to which the notion of absorption can scarcely be applied. And by the time he came to conceive and paint the Leonidas, he seems to have found himself compelled throughout most of this teeming composition to forego all but the most nominal or superficial representation of action and expression, and to concentrate instead upon depicting, in the figure of the Spartan general, an inward state. The term absorption once again seems appropriate, but a state that David himself described in terms so unworldly as to call into question the very possibility of its outward manifestation. We see in these developments, I want to claim, a progressive loss of conviction in action and expression as vehicles of absorption and anti-theatricality, and therefore a loss of them as resources for ambitious painting as Diderot had theorized it. Put another way, David's history paintings, from the Belisarius through the Leonidas, chart the trajectory of an ever-deepening pictorial and, I want to say, ontological crisis, and I want to talk about certain implications of that. And the works to which I now want to turn, I want you just to have this sense. We have this development that creates a real crisis. You're committed to anti-theatricality, but it's driving you away from being able to depict action and expression in the world. Now, the works I now want to look at with you are known collectively as David's anacreonic paintings, N-A-N-A-C-R-E-O-N-I-C, anacreonic. That's derived from their imagined loose reference to the love poetry of an ancient Greek poet named Anacreon. So, and they're called anacreonic on the basis of their general reliance on classical Greek subject matter of a distinctly non-tragic, non-dramatic sort, scenes of mythology, in most cases keyed to themes of love. These belong to his later career. Let me just give you something to look at. And you can suddenly see we're in another world, right? It's almost shocking, right? Given what you've just been looking at. Right? Sorry, don't want that. No, we're going, yeah, okay, that's what we want. They were, for the most, they were painted in, most of them were painted in Brussels, where the painter and his wife moved in January 1816, following the decree that all former deputies who had voted the death of Louis XVI, as David had done, were to be banished from France. David was a Jacobin. He was totally involved in the bloodiest years of the French Revolution. He voted the death of Louis XVI. He was loyal to Robespierre and Marat. He was lucky to not get guillotined himself when Robespierre fell. He was jailed for about a year, and so on. But he also, when the Bourbons got restored to the throne of France, he refused to kind of abjure his previous commitments, and this is also after Napoleon. And so he, in effect, was exiled and lived the rest of his life till he died in 1825 in Brussels. Until fairly recently, the anacreonic paintings received relatively little attention from scholars. The prevailing view has been that the aesthetic level of David's art suffered a sharp falling off after he left Paris. And indeed, the art of the preceding years, during which he was, for all intents and purposes, court painter to Napoleon, has also widely been perceived as of uneven quality. We're not going to look at those. More recently, however, there's taken place a kind of growth of interest, dramatic growth of interest in the later work, as expressed first in Dorothy Johnson's monographic study of 1993, a book on David, and second in Philippe Baud's exhibition catalog, Jacques-Louis David, Empire to Exile of 2005, and then a collection of essays mainly drawn from a symposium associated with that exhibition called David After David, 2007. I think that growth of interest is justified. These are important pictures by a major painter, and they deserve to be taken seriously, both in their own right and for what they can tell us about the state of ambitious painting during the years immediately preceding the emergence of Géricault and the young Delacroix, the years just preceding Romanticism. But they, too, are deeply problematic works, ones that continue to present a challenge to our capacity for historical and indeed aesthetic understanding in the broadest sense of the terms. Now, as you might imagine, I'm going to argue that the issues that I've just laid out in the opening minutes of this talk are crucial to making historical sense of what these paintings place before our eyes. Now, the first of the anacreonic paintings is Sappho, Phaon, and Cupid. It's today in St. Petersburg in the Hermitage, and it was painted in 1809, while David was still in Paris. And in some respects, it remains the most fascinating of all those paintings. We know that it was painted for the Russian Count Yusupov, but there's no reason to think that the conception was not wholly David's, and it's precisely its conception that is of the greatest interest to us this evening. Ideally, we would all be standing before the actual canvas. We'd all go to St. Petersburg, and I would proceed in Socratic fashion. I mean, we'd have a large seminar in front of the painting, and I would ask each of you in turn to describe the main action. Just that for a start. What do you think's going on? And then we could proceed to think together about what that action might be taken to imply. But I can't quite do that. So instead, I'm going to just tell you what I think is taking place. Let me say in advance that I think what is taking place is pretty obvious, but that for various mutually reinforcing reasons, scholars have refused to allow themselves to see it. Here goes then. Sappho, the famous poet of Lesbos, has been composing lyric poetry on her lyre, or improvising lyric poetry on her lyre. This has been going on for some time, with her male lover, Phaon, standing behind her. In the moment depicted in the painting, Phaon has turned Sappho's head toward this side of the picture, which of course is where are to be found both painter and beholder. And at just that moment, too, the kneeling Amor, the kneeling Cupid, has removed her lyre from the grasp of her hands. Or until that moment, presumably, he was supporting it as she played. Possibly he's still supporting it, but Phaon's gesture has moved her back from the lyre so that her fingers seem to pluck only air. The reason I said that the basic scene has persisted for some time, I mean, the moral of the story at this point, the methodological moral is, don't hesitate to describe paintings closely, to look at them very closely and try to figure out what's going on in them. That isn't naive. That's actually basic, right? To take seriously the project of just trying to figure out what are we being shown. And the reason it matters, it's going to matter a lot, whether or not we see Féant as someone who has just entered the scene. I mean, one possible interpretation, and it's there in print, people have entertained it, is Sappho is playing, and suddenly Féant has arrived, and she's so in love with Féant that she reacts in this sort of goofy way. But I think there's strong evidence to suggest that that's wrong. And it's wrong because Féant's been there for some time. And the reason I say that the basic scene has persisted for some time is that Féant has been depicted standing with his right leg crossed over his left and leaning with his right hand on the arm of the chair in which Sappho has been sitting. In other words, his stance has nothing in it of the momentary. On the contrary, nor indeed does his gaze directly out of the painting, which gives the strong impression of having been directed for some time toward another opposite gaze, this side of the picture surface, one for which the entire scene has been arranged. Féant's spear, too, with its butt end on the ground and its upper portion resting against his upper chest, bespeaks nothing if not stability. And what this suggests to me, and here is where description almost palpably becomes interpretation, is that Sappho and Féant have been posing for the painter. Féant standing and facing the painter, Sappho seated at right angles to the picture plane and composing on her lyre, or maybe pretending to compose, but I think composing, and making up poetry. But then something happened. Perhaps Sappho became too caught up, too intensely absorbed in her playing and singing for the good of the composition. Or perhaps there simply came a moment when she was requested to turn her gaze toward the painter, presumably by the painter. But of course, this must remain forever an inference. A request that in the painting as we have it is now being acted upon by Féant, who grasps the poet's lower face and turns it physically in the direction in question, physically toward the painter, as if he was saying, "Chérie, please stop poetizing for a minute and look at David. He's been very patient." The overall effect comes close to being photographic, all the more so in that Féant's features convey the sense of having been based on those of an actual model. All this, I realize, amounts to a somewhat extraordinary claim, which is doubtless why the painting has not been viewed in these terms by anyone else. But having spent hours within recent years standing before the actual canvas, first in Williamstown, and then, I'm happy to say, on one occasion in St. Petersburg, and not just by myself, but in the company of intelligent and perceptive friends with whom I discussed the topic in minute detail, I really don't see any credible alternative to the description I've just offered. Now, the question that now arises, if you accept this, is what it means that David in 1808, 1809 conceived and executed a large painting with such an odd scenario. And the answer I want to suggest is that the Sappho, Féant, and Amour marks a significant turning in David's art. The moment when, simply put, David recognized that the entire Diderottian project of somehow negating or neutralizing the beholder by virtue of the persuasive depiction of absorption and more broadly of the lateral coherence of the tableau was no longer feasible, or at any rate was no longer within the power of his art to realize. And that if he wanted to continue making works based on classical subject matter, which for him remained one of the key indices of high pictorial ambition, he had no alternative, not just to relinquish, but to abjure and revoke that project by emphatically turning his figures toward the viewer. In other words, by embracing the theatricality that until then he had been striving to defeat. Now, all this would be fascinating simply in its own terms. But what gives it added interest, to put it mildly, is that such a pictorial strategy anticipates by more than half a century the development that I have associated with Edouard Manet's breakthrough masterpieces of the first half of the 1860s. For example, The Old Musician of 1862, The Déjeuner sur l'herbe of 1862-63, and the great painting we're looking at, the Olympia, painted in 1863, but not exhibited until the Salon of 65. More precisely, in my book, Manet's Modernism and Other Writings, my claim has been that starting around 1860, again in France, the Diderottian project that had got underway just over a century before, of somehow overcoming theatricality, had reached a new, more urgent phase of crisis. Not that no painters of major ambition after that date sought to make absorptive paintings, both as regards individual figures and as regards entire compositions, that wouldn't be true. But as the key example of Jean-François Millet shows, it was no longer possible for paintings such as his to impose themselves as truly absorptive, which is to say as anti-theatrical in their overall effect on more than a fraction of the sophisticated viewing audience. At any rate, this seems to me the lesson of Millet's intensely divided status among the serious art critics of the 1850s and 60s, some of whom continued to admire him on Diderottian grounds, but others of whom, including writers like Baudelaire, Duranty, Gautier, found his peasant personages altogether false and mannered, merely pretending to sow potatoes or shovel manure or say their prayers rather than actually doing those things. Put this way, of course, it should be clear that the task of the historian, our task, so to speak, is, in the face of this divided body of writing, is not to take sides, not to decide whether his personages are or not authentically shoveling manure, right? Remember, those personages are mere depictions. They're not actual peasants, either absorbed in what they're doing or merely pretending to be so. The important point is that the absorptive strategy was now likely to misfire. And the chief anti-theatrical project of the previous generation, Gustave Courbet's, and now this is, I'm just condensing an entire book in the half sentence, his hyperbolic attempt to paint himself all but corporeally into his paintings, which I think can be shown to be going on in his major pictures. Being hyperbolic, being so extreme, being off the charts, really, was never a pictorial option for anyone but Courbet himself, quite apart from the fact that by the 1860s, the works in which that project found its fullest expression belonged squarely to the past. Enter Manet, that's the point, around 1860. And what we find in the major canvases of the 1860s is precisely a decisive giving up of the Diderottian project in its various forms, and a compensatory strategy that I've associated with two terms drawn from the criticism of his time, facingness and strikingness. That is, Manet's breakthrough pictures of the early 1860s may be said to face the beholder with a new vehemence, a new power of address, keyed not just to their mise en scène, but also to their handling of contrasts of light and dark, so striking in the Olympia. They're somewhat grating in the eyes of contemporaries' treatment of relations of color, and certain hard-to-summarize aspects of their execution. Also to their characteristic effect, I think you could sense this maybe even in the Olympia, of a kind of abstract instantaneousness, as if the painting as a whole stamped itself out unforgettably in the very moment of encounter. In all these respects, there is, of course, a considerable dissimilarity between the Saphin, Féant, and Amour, with its bright color, meticulous execution, and jewel-like details, and the Olympia and related Manets of the early 1860s. And yet there's enough of a resemblance, by which I mean not simply enough of a formal accord between them as compositions, but more important, a deep analogy between the respective pictorial dynamics or dialectics that brought them into being, to cast the differences between them in a singularly interesting light, as if what one would now like to know, or would like to know how to begin to investigate, is by virtue of what combination of prior and present conditions and commitments did Manet's embrace of facingness, to mention only that, have the epical consequences that turned out to follow. I mean, Impressionism, and you could say modern painting generally, streams out of Manet's paintings of the first half of the 1860s. Obviously, I can't pursue that line of thought this evening. The simple fact is that facingness in Manet is inseparable from what has come to be called his modernism, which is also to say his foundational status for the younger painters who came to be called the Impressionists and everything that flowed from that. Whereas the same basic strategy in post-1800 David had no comparable significance. In fact, the anacreonic paintings as a group led nowhere, artistically speaking. But this in turn does not mean that Sappho, Phaon, and more broadly, the anacreonic paintings as a group are not works of the highest historical interest. In other words, what happens in them is what's later going to happen in Manet, but with different consequences. And that opens up an extremely interesting historical question as to why. Why did it go nowhere in the first place? Why did it go everywhere in the second place? And in a much longer version of this essay, I've tried to deal with that. I now want to turn to another of the anacreonic paintings, in some respects, the most controversial of all. It's called Love Leaving Psyche, or Cupid and Psyche, simply, of 1817, in the Cleveland Museum of Art. Now, as various scholars have noted, the first critics of the painting were disconcerted by the depiction of Cupid, who has been represented disengaging himself from the sleeping Psyche as he looks directly toward the beholder, a sexually frank smile on his face. So a critic named Caravaggio in 1819, it is appalling, this empire of a base sort over idealism. It strangles the heart. Indeed, this historian I mentioned a moment ago, Dorothy Johnson, admits being put off by the painting on these grounds. We are disconcerted, she writes, by this terrible conjunction of a realistically depicted saurian god of love and the idealized beautiful young woman by his side who is under the domination of this loathsome monster. The contrast between the dark, sinister, ugly Cupid, whose cynical, leering, self-satisfied grin is directed at us, with the sensual yet vulnerable Psyche also causes much disquiet. Equally disturbing is Cupid's action, for he seems about to step out into our space as if he were a disquieting intruder in our world and not safely contained in a remote mythological past. I mean, obviously her response is extreme, but she's on to something that's clearly going on in this picture. I mean, Cupid is naked, and there's drapery that covers him here, but he's got the most extraordinary erect big toe, and it's clearly meant, you know. I mean, David would be deeply disappointed if we didn't notice the toe. So in the pages that follow, Johnson summarizes various literary sources, mainly Apuleius and La Fontaine, and she concludes by suggesting that David's aim was precisely to bring about, quote, an ironic reversal of the Aubade tradition. This is very kind of standard intellectualist account that manages, on the one hand, to be appalled by what's going on and then, as much as possible, not think about it. To express a disturbing psychological truth that underlies the charming surface of the literary versions of the myth, he has represented Psyche as a sexual slave, captive of the leering, satiated Cupid. And there are other interpretations that seem to me somehow don't quite deal with the picture. So I'm not persuaded by those sorts of readings. Because I think both of them all these readings deflect attention away from what I take to be the most striking feature of the painting. Not that Johnson fails to mention it, namely the extraordinary daring with which the figure of Cupid has been depicted about to step from the world of the painting into the space, the world of the beholder. And the result of this, I want to suggest, is a further radicalization of the address to both painter and beholder in the Sappho, Phaon, and Amor. I mean, in the Sappho, Phaon, and Amor, we get this turning to the viewer. Here, it's like a turning to the viewer is not enough. Cupid's going to enter our space, one that aims to make all but tangible the physical presence, the corporeal reality of the figure of Cupid, in stark contrast to the still blissfully sleeping, still utterly absorbed figure of Psyche. In other words, my impulse is to discard any kind of moralistic slant and to stress again the extraordinary boldness with which David has made use of a mythological subject for his own highly unorthodox pictorial purposes, purposes that had to do essentially with the Diderottian issue of the encounter between painting and beholder. In this connection, does it go too far to suggest that the sense of extreme discomfort that the Cupid and Psyche evidently provoked in both early viewers and more recent commentators invites comparison with the documented responses to Manet's Olympia when it appeared before the Parisian public in the Salon of 1865? People were absolutely distressed by that painting. The government literally had to assign a gendarme to stand in front of it to keep people from doing damage to it. I think the comparison is germane, especially when we bear in mind that the figure of Cupid was seen, and indeed continues to be seen, as disturbingly realistic on the strength of his skin color and distinctly non-ideal body type and his facial features. In fact, Cupid was modeled for by the 17-year-old son of the American diplomat, Albert Gallatin. And amusingly, the young man in his journal regrets that he and the young model for Psyche are not to pose together. So there's time to look briefly at just one more painting, but before I do, I want to suggest that one way of thinking of the developments I've been tracking is not simply as a deliberate reversal of the no longer feasible anti-theatrical project of David's prime, but also as a strategy designed to compensate for the felt loss of a certain unforced sense of lived bodily reality, to speak phenomenologically, as regards his figures and their worlds. And what I mean becomes clear if we turn to another mythological, though not exactly anachronic work, The Anger of Achilles of 1819 at the Kimball Art Museum in Fort Worth. Here we're dealing with a new format, one ultimately based on that of various Caravaggios of the early 1600s, in which half-length figures are juxtaposed in a shallow space, seemingly in close proximity to the picture surface. The subject is drawn from the background to the Iliad, and specifically, it seems, from the playwright Jean Racine's tragedy, Iphigénie in Aulide, from the 17th century, which Dorothy Johnson again tells us was performed often in Paris in the early 19th century. On the other hand, as Thomas Crow emphasizes, there's no equivalent scene in the play, and Crow also cites a recently discovered letter from David to a Monsieur Van Guffel of July 1819, in which the artist declares the subject of his painting to be as follows. So this is David now. The Anger of Achilles. The painter has chosen the moment when Achilles confronts Agamemnon as he is leading his daughter Iphigenia to be sacrificed. At the very beginning of the Trojan War, I mean, before the war even got underway, the Greek fleet assembled to go to Troy, and there was no wind. Agamemnon, the leader of the expedition, consulted the priest, and the priest said that a sacrifice was required, namely Agamemnon's daughter, Iphigenia, and the great Agamemnon complied. And this is part of the background story to a lot of Greek tragedy that follows. This rage of Achilles, who was, according to this story, in effect engaged to Iphigenia. This rage of Achilles stops the tears of Clytemnestra, the queen, Iphigenia's mother, Agamemnon's wife, and gives her a brief glimmer of hope for her daughter, unquote. So accordingly, going from left to right, the figures in the painting represent, from right to left, Agamemnon at the right, the king, Iphigenia, his daughter, Clytemnestra, his wife, and Achilles. And we see Achilles from behind with his helmeted head in profile. In no version of the story does Achilles actually kill the king. Johnson persuasively suggests that David has tried to show Agamemnon subjecting Achilles with his gaze and the downward gesture of his right arm and hand. Now, I don't know how clearly you can see this from where you're sitting. Again, I wish we could go to Fort Worth. But in this canvas, the emphasis falls squarely on what I will call the expressivity of the individual figures, to a degree probably unprecedented in David's art. Another historian refers aptly to a quartet of diverging affects, which again he compares to moments in recent operas. More precisely, there's a striking contrast between the male and female figures that harks back to a not dissimilar opposition in the Horatii, between the active but emotionally restrained men and the essentially passive but emotionally reactive women. And then there's a subtler pair of contrasts between the two men, between Agamemnon and Achilles, and between the two women. Thus, Agamemnon's air of command is set off against Achilles' impetuous reaching for his weapon. Iphigenia has been depicted sad, as if withdrawn into herself, evidently accepting her fate. She's a good daughter, while Clytemnestra, tall, wearing her crown, one hand on her daughter's shoulder, appears dignified but deeply unhappy, even as she turns her gaze, hopefully, David's text suggests, on the ostensibly angry Achilles. Her red eyelids show clearly that she's been weeping. Eventually, of course, when Agamemnon returns to Athens, she and her lover Aegisthus will kill him. But that's a long way from now. In short, one has the sense that for David himself, the artistic success of his canvas hinged more than anything else on its ability to evoke tragic depths of feeling, especially perhaps in the figures of the two women. And yet, and again, I'm not certain you can see this, I guarantee it would be obvious in front of the canvas, one also has the conviction that the painting's expressivity is curiously external, a matter of what might be called deliberate affective nuance, by which I don't quite mean to say that it's false or theatrical. It's rather that the longer and more closely one looks, the more fully one responds to the invitation the painting proffers to study it at close range, the more one becomes aware that Iphigenia's sadness and Clytemnestra's grief have been applied to them from outside, so to speak, by the painter. That instead of striking the viewer as the spontaneous overflow of feelings welling up from within their souls, both women's expressions reveal themselves to be mere external signs that the painter has deployed, not so much in order to produce a particular emotional effect on the beholder, that would be theatrical in a pejorative sense of the term, as in an attempt to render the expressive truth of a potentially tragic situation in the interests of a certain affective realism, one might say. Agamemnon's expression, too, seems more willed and spontaneous, while Achilles, and it's here that the painting most obviously runs into trouble, is in the first place appears almost completely facially inexpressive, apart from a reddish blush that spreads across his cheeks, another manifestly external sign of inner feeling. And in the second has been depicted reaching with his right arm, not so much across his body as across his face. I mean, it's the weirdest kind of thing, in a manner that lacks all physical and dynamic verisimilitude, as if David found himself driven to this extraordinarily awkward expedient by the desire to show as much as possible of Achilles' arm and hand, rather than have them be obscured from view behind his body. Indeed, it's quite astonishing to find David in the 1780s, and for that matter, the 1790s. I mean, just think of the figures, the sons in the Oath of the Horatii. In that earlier painting, he was an absolute master of the convincing depiction of powerful bodies totally engaged in energetic action. It's amazing to think of that painter now allowing such an unnatural, unpersuasive, almost boneless-seeming treatment of action to go forth from his studio. Let me be clear. The point of these remarks, too, is not at all to degrade the anger of Achilles, which, like the other works we've discussed, I take to be a painting of the highest significance. More precisely, I view this canvas as laying bare, with particular clarity, something that had been going on in David's art for some time, which a few minutes ago I characterized as the felt loss of an unforced sense of lived bodily reality, which is to say of the ability to suggest that the actions and emotions that we see depicted in a painting actually, what do I do? No. I hit no. Okay, totally cool. That's, like, for me, a high technical moment. I've never done anything, anything that coherent with a computer in my life. My daughter would be proud of me. And I'm saying that what we've been tracking is something like the progressive loss of an unforced sense of lived bodily reality, of the ability to suggest that the actions and emotions that we see depicted in a painting actually originated within the figures, the personages themselves. My further suggestion, my final point in this lecture, is that there exists an intimate connection, virtually of cause and effect, between David's embrace of theatricality in the Sappho, Phaon, and Amour, and other anacreonic paintings, and the loss of all sense of psychophysical inwardness in those same paintings, as well as in the anger of Achilles. Put slightly differently, according to the structure of the Diderottian tableau, the beholder is understood as, in effect, walled off or, say, radically separated from the action taking place on the stage or in the fictive, laterally organized space of the painting. But by virtue of that strategic walling off, the beholder is also given something like free imaginative access to the depicted action, as well as to the implied states of mind and feeling, the inner motivations of the dramatis personae. Again, think of the Horatii. Starting in the early 1800s, however, the Diderottian strategy is abandoned, and the beholder is directly addressed to the extent of feeling himself or herself the principal focus of the composition in the Sappho, Phaon, and Amour, or indeed on the verge of being physically confronted by one of the figures in the Cupid and Psyche. And when that happens, what I've just described as free imaginative access to the inner lives of the dramatis personae turns out to go by the board. Put another way, what I've been calling the world of the representation is now voided, emptied out in favor of the world in which the painting is encountered, even as that world is defined as one of sheerest externality, a world, one might say, of mere confrontation, mere surfaces. The singular achievement of the anacreonic pictures is to have pursued this logic with complete lucidity. Is all this David's ultimate comment on, one might say his ultimate accommodation to, the world of Napoleonic theatricality? Or is it also, following Napoleon's defeat, his accommodation to a world in which heroism as such was no longer imaginable, at least by him, in any but a profoundly ironic register, one in which, nevertheless, a role had to be found for pictorial ambition as such? It's impossible to say. If we had another minute, but we don't, I would say a few words about David's late aporetic drawings, as they're called, which exemplify a still more extreme development, consisting for the most part in indeterminately expressive heads, in no intelligible relation to one another. These mysterious works relate only to the painter's imagination, and thus give no purchase for the very thought of worldhood. But our time is up, and I will close by showing you another work of 1819. The Anger of Achilles was 1819, by a younger French artist of genius, in which a certain recovery of a sense of embodiment takes place massively and indeed unforgettably, though very much in terms that leave no doubt that the story of the body in early 19th century French art is not a happy one. I mean Géricault's great Raft of the Medusa. Thank you for your attention.